Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We're going to be talking about something you might not hear about every day. We're diving into the kind of hidden marital challenges faced by African immigrant couples, especially when the husband comes to the U.S. first.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a research briefing and a personal account we're looking at today to give us a well-rounded view,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people think about, like, oh, the excitement of, like, starting a new life in America.
Right.
But what we don't often hear about is the years.
Of separation, right?
Yeah.
Like that couples endure because of immigration processes,
Yeah.
and the unique strains this puts on the relationship.
Exactly.
So I'm kind of curious, what kind of psychological impact does this separation have?
Yeah.
It can't be easy to adjust to life in a new country and also feeling emotionally disconnected.
No, it's definitely not easy. It's what's really striking is that the research has shown that the left behind spouse
Yeah.
is actually twice as likely to experience depression.
Compared to those who migrated together. And this is largely because of that lack of emotional intimacy.
Right.
And also the constant worry about their partner's well-being.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And to complicate matters even more,
Right.
our sources are suggesting that this prolonged waiting period, like to get through the process, sometimes can lead to some unexpected relationship development.
Oh, yeah.
Like, people don't really think about that.
Yes, and this is where things get really delicate. So imagine you're waiting for years to get immigration clearance.
Right.
You're trying to build a life in a new country,
Yeah.
but you're feeling that distance from your partner.
Yeah.
So the research is showing that in these types of situations, new connections can form, even romantic ones,
Yeah. Yeah, that throws a whole other wrench into things.
Right,
And, I'm thinking about that personal account we have,
right.
where the wife finally reunites with her husband,
Yeah.
only to discover, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a fairy tale ending. And what really struck me was how she described feeling like a stranger in her own marriage.
Yeah, and that feeling of displacement is unfortunately not uncommon.
Oh, wow.
Because what was supposed to be this joyous reunion often becomes a catalyst for conflict. And, it's not just about adjusting to a new culture. Imagine dealing with those feelings of betrayal and insecurity on top of having to navigate this whole new world.
Oh, man, that sounds incredibly overwhelming.
It is.
It really makes you wonder, does the stress of the reunion
Yeah.
overshadow the joy of actually finally being together?
It absolutely can. And what's interesting is that even when there isn't another relationship
Yeah.
that's involved,
Right.
the cultural adjustment itself can be a major hurdle.
That's true.
And we often underestimate the sheer magnitude of change the newly arrived spouse experiences.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that, it's not just moving to a new place.
Right.
It's adapting to a whole new way of life.
Yeah.
Like, everything's different.
Exactly. And for someone who has spent years building a life in the U.S., their perspective might have shifted
Right.
without them even realizing it.
Right.
You know?
So even seemingly small things,
Yeah.
like, differences in how you communicate or daily routines
Right.
could potentially become sources of friction.
Absolutely. And that's where all those cultural nuances we talk about
Yeah.
really come into play, because what might be considered normal behavior in one culture could be interpreted completely differently in another.
Yeah, that's a great point. With all these layers of complexity,
Right.
how do these couples even begin to navigate these challenges?
That's a good question.
Like, does the research offer any insights
It does.
into, like, coping mechanisms or strategies for building resilience?
It does. And this is where I think those recommendations from our sources become really valuable.
Yeah.
One of the key takeaways is the importance of having really open and honest communication, both before and during the separation. It's really about setting realistic expectations,
Right.
acknowledging the potential difficulties,
Yeah.
and finding ways to stay emotionally connected despite the distance.
So it's almost like you're proactively preparing
Yes.
for these potential pitfalls,
Yeah.
like having a game plan in place.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the research suggests that couples who actively engage in something called pre-departure counseling
Okay.
tend to have a smoother transition and report higher levels of marital satisfaction.
Well, that's great.
No.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's like getting a head start on building those coping mechanisms and communication skills
Yeah.
that are going to be so crucial down the line.
Right. It's about equipping themselves with the tools they need.
Yeah.
to navigate the challenges.
So we've talked about the emotional toll of separation.
Right.
We've talked about the added hurdles of reunification.
Yes.
But what about the long-term impact on the relationship itself?
Right.
Like, does this experience ultimately make the marriage stronger, or does it put them at greater risk of divorce?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the research paints a somewhat sobering picture.
Oh, no.
Because when you combine the emotional strain of separation, the potential for new relationships,
Yeah.
and the challenges of adjusting to this new life, it creates like this perfect storm
Wow.
for marital problems.
So it's not just about surviving the separation.
Yeah.
It's about how do you rebuild and reconnect afterward.
Exactly. And this is where I think the role of community support becomes critical.
Uh-huh.
Having a network of people who understand what you're going through,
Right.
who can offer practical and emotional assistance, can be incredibly beneficial.
You know, that's interesting you say community support.
Right.
While I can see how that's a source of strength, I also wonder if it sometimes adds to the pressure
Oh, yeah.
to maintain a facade of marital harmony,
Right.
even when things are falling apart.
Yeah. That's a really insightful observation.
Yeah.
You're right. It can be a double-edged sword.
Okay.
So on the one hand, you have those community ties,
Mm-hmm.
and they can provide that sense of belonging and shared experience.
Right.
But on the other hand, they can also create this sense of obligation and pressure to conform
Right.
to certain cultural norms.
So it's about finding that balance
Right.
between seeking support, but also maintaining your own sense of agency within the relationship.
Exactly. And this is where I think culturally sensitive counseling can play a crucial role.
Okay.
It's about creating that safe space where couples can openly explore their challenges without feeling judged or misunderstood,
Right.
and where they can learn to communicate in a way that honors both their individual needs and also their cultural values.
I think this, brings up a really important point that there's a real need for more awareness and understanding of these unique challenges.
Yeah.
And it's not just within the African immigrant community, but also within, the wider society.
Right, exactly.
We need to be talking about this.
I couldn't agree more. It's about recognizing that their stories are our stories, and that we all have a role to play in creating a more welcoming and supportive environment
Yeah.
for immigrant families.
Yeah. And, we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still so much more to explore.
Right.
So in part 2 of our deep dive, we'll delve deeper into the cultural nuances and societal factors that contribute to these marital challenges.
Yeah.
We'll also examine the specific ways in which gender roles and communication styles can impact relationship dynamics.
Right.
So stay tuned for more. We're back and still digging into these marital challenges that African immigrant couples face, especially when the husband is the one who comes to the U.S. first.
Right.
We've talked about how hard the separation is,
Yeah.
and then how hard it is when they finally reunite.
Right.
But I'm starting to see that there's this whole other layer we haven't really talked about,
Yeah.
and it's all these cultural differences.
Oh, absolutely.
It's easy to just think, oh, love will conquer all,
Right.
But when you add in different cultures, different expectations for marriage, different values,
Yeah.
it just gets so much more complicated.
It really does. For example, a lot of African cultures, they put so much value on family
Yeah,
and community support.
right.
And on the surface, that's a good thing.
Yeah, it seems like a good thing.
Yeah, it's like you've got this built-in safety net for the spouse that stayed behind.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So that would be a source of comfort and strength for them.
It is, but there's also kind of like a downside to it.
Okay.
Having such strong community ties can sometimes create this unspoken pressure to keep up appearances,
Oh, I see.
to look like everything's perfect even when it's not.
Okay, yeah, so they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Right.
Because you've got their own struggles, but then also all these expectations from their community.
Exactly. And that can make it so hard to ask for help or even admit that something's wrong,
Yeah.
especially if they're afraid of being judged or, even shut out by their community.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It's a tough spot to be in, for sure. I was reading that personal account,
Yeah.
and I noticed how much the wife struggled with this.
Right.
She talked about having to put on this brave face.
Yeah.
for her family and friends.
Yeah.
Even though inside she just felt like she was falling apart.
Right. And that really highlights a really important point.
Yeah.
We can't just give generic relationship advice.
Right.
The support really needs to be tailored to the specific culture of that couple.
Right. And speaking of cultural contexts,
Yes.
I'm curious how traditional gender roles play into this whole dynamic. Because
Yeah.
I know in many African cultures,
Mm-hmm.
there's this strong expectation that the husband is the provider.
Yeah.
He's the one making decisions.
Yes.
So how does that change
Right.
when he's the one who's moved away
Yeah.
and established a new life in the U.S.?
That's such a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something that we often overlook.
Yeah.
The physical distance can actually intensify those gender dynamics. So the wife, she might have held a position of authority or influence back home,
Right.
but now she might feel powerless in this new situation.
Right.
Again.
And on the flip side,
Yeah.
the husband might feel even more pressure to live up to those expectations
Exactly.
of being the provider and decision maker,
Right.
even if he's also having a hard time adjusting.
Exactly.
Like
It's such a difficult balancing act.
Right.
And then on top of all of that, you have those cultural differences in the ways people communicate,
Oh, yeah.
you know?
That's a fascinating point. I hadn't even thought about that.
Right.
How could those communication styles clash?
Well, you see, different cultures have these different norms
Yeah.
about how you share emotions, how you handle disagreements,
Yeah.
even just like everyday conversations.
Right.
For example, in some African cultures, like directly confronting someone can be seen as disrespectful.
Oh.
Whereas in American culture, people are encouraged to be very direct and assertive.
So you could have a situation where the husband's trying to be open about his struggles in the U.S.
Yes,
But then his wife sees that as a weakness.
exactly.
Or that he's not living up to his role.
Exactly.
Or the other way around.
Yes.
The wife might be expressing how lonely she is and how isolated she feels, but the husband might think that she's nagging or complaining.
Exactly.
It's like they're speaking totally different languages,
As it is.
even if they're using the same words.
Yes.
And all that miscommunication can really damage the trust and the closeness in their relationship.
Absolutely. And this is where I think those practical recommendations from our sources are so helpful.
Yeah.
They emphasize that couples need to develop ways of communicating that work for them, for their specific relationship dynamic.
So it's not just about talking more.
Yeah.
It's about learning how to communicate well,
Yes.
considering all those cultural differences and,
Yes.
being sensitive to each other.
Exactly. And that's where community-based organizations and therapists who understand their culture can be so helpful.
Yeah.
They can offer a safe place for these couples to talk about their problems without feeling judged or misunderstood.
Yeah. As we're talking about this, it's making me realize that we have to be careful about making assumptions about people.
Yes.
Because every couple's story is going to be different.
It is.
It depends on their personalities,
Yeah.
their cultural backgrounds, their communication style.
Right.
It's also unique to them.
You're absolutely right. But I think if we can understand these broader cultural and societal factors,
Yeah.
then we can start to come up with better ways, more effective ways to support these families.
It's about understanding how complex their situations are
Right.
and then giving them resources that are actually helpful for them and their specific needs.
Exactly.
It's striking me as we're talking about this, these challenges aren't only faced by African immigrant couples.
Right.
Think about military families,
Yes.
couples where maybe one of them travels a lot for work.
Right.
They all have similar problems when it comes to staying close
Yes.
and connected.
Yes. That's a great observation.
Yeah.
And it shows a bigger point here. While the cultural context might be different,
Yeah.
the core issues of being separated and then coming back together, those are universal.
That's so true. And I think that's something for all our listeners to think about.
Right.
Even if this specific situation isn't something they've personally experienced, the insights we're talking about can be applied to any relationship
Yeah.
where they're dealing with distance
Right.
and cultural differences.
Exactly.
We've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff,
Yeah.
but I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some solutions.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I think it's easy to get bogged down in the problems.
Right.
But we always got to remember that there is hope
Right.
and there's always a way forward.
Exactly.
So in part 3 of our deep dive, we're going to explore some practical strategies
Okay.
to help these relationships get stronger
Yeah.
and help these couples thrive.
I like it.
We'll look at pre-departure counseling,
Yes.
how important it is to communicate openly and honestly, and how powerful it can be to use community resources.
Right.
So stay with us. Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive, looking at all these challenges that African immigrant couples face, especially when the husband is the one who comes here to the U.S. first.
Right.
We've really dug into some difficult stuff, but now I want to focus on what can we do about this?
Yeah.
Because these issues are tough, they're complicated, but I don't think they're impossible to overcome. And thankfully, our sources have given us some really good advice on how to help these couples.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping we can talk about those in more detail and really give our listeners something to think about, some takeaways.
Yeah. For sure.
So we've mentioned this before, but I think it's important to emphasize it again. Pre-departure counseling.
Yes.
It can really make all the difference. It's like that saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Exactly.
So you're basically trying to give couples all the tools and information they need before they even start this journey.
Right.
But what does that actually look like?
Well, it's about sitting down and having these honest conversations.
Okay.
About their expectations, about the challenges they might face, even those fears they might not even be talking about.
Right.
They have to accept that this separation is going to have an impact on their relationship.
Yeah.
And it's much better to face those issues head on
Right.
than to just pretend they don't exist.
Makes me think of a couple packing for a long trip. They wouldn't just throw random stuff in a suitcase. They would think carefully about what they need to survive and to thrive.
I love that. It's so true.
And it's not just practical things like money or visas.
Right.
It's about being emotionally ready.
Yes.
So developing ways to communicate in a healthy way, setting boundaries, and figuring out how to work through disagreements without things getting out of hand.
Exactly. You're building that foundation that can help them weather those storms
Right.
that are bound to come up in any long-distance relationship.
Especially when you're talking about immigration.
Yes, for sure. And research actually shows that couples who go through pre-departure counseling, they tend to be happier in their marriage.
Oh, that's good to hear.
And they're better prepared to handle all the challenges.
So that pre-departure counseling, that's like the first step.
It is.
But what about staying connected during all those years when they're apart?
Right.
I'm guessing that communication is key.
Absolutely. It's the lifeline.
Yeah.
Frequent and open communication is absolutely essential.
Okay.
But it's not just about telling each other about the good parts of your day.
Right.
It's about opening up, sharing your fears and worries.
Being vulnerable.
Yes, and truly listening to what your partner is going through.
I bet the technology helps a lot here.
Oh, absolutely.
Like couples can connect now in ways that they couldn't even dream of before.
Right.
Video calls, texting, even just sharing photos and videos.
Right.
It all makes such a difference.
It does.
It helps them feel closer,
Yeah.
like they're still part of each other's lives.
Exactly.
But what about when they finally get to be together again?
Right.
It's easy to assume everything's going to be perfect.
Right.
But our personal account, it kind of shows us that it's not always like that.
No, it's not.
It can be just as hard, maybe even harder, to be back together after being apart for so long.
Yeah, sometimes there's that initial excitement, like a honeymoon phase, but then reality sets in, and they have to figure out how to adjust to this new life together.
And that personal account, I mean, it really showed that.
It did.
The wife, she talks about feeling like a stranger in her own home.
Yeah.
Like she didn't even know her husband anymore.
Right.
He'd changed so much.
And that's really common, that feeling of displacement.
Yeah.
The one who just arrived, they're dealing with culture shock, language barriers, and the pressure to fit in.
Right.
And the one who's been here, well, they've changed too.
Yeah.
Maybe without even realizing it.
So it's like they're meeting each other for the first time all over again,
It is.
which can be exciting,
Yeah.
but also really scary.
Absolutely. And that's where all those communication skills we talked about are so important.
Right.
It's about being patient, understanding, and being willing to compromise. They have to rebuild that trust.
And this is where I think community support is so important.
Yes.
Our sources talk about how important it is to have counseling services and community groups that understand their culture so they can get the support they need.
Having people who understand what you're going through, who can listen, give advice, or just be there for you, it makes a huge difference.
And it doesn't have to be some formal program.
Right.
Sometimes just having friends and family who will listen without judgment can be so helpful.
Absolutely.
And, there are things couples can do on their own to strengthen their relationship.
Yes.
Have you ever heard of learning each other's love languages?
Oh, yeah, that's a great one.
So for those who aren't familiar, love languages are basically the ways we show love and feel loved.
Right.
Like some people feel loved when you say nice things to them,
Yes.
others feel loved when you do things for them, and so on.
Exactly.
So if you understand your partner's love language, you can show them you love them in a way that really means something to them.
Even when you're apart.
So you're basically learning to speak their emotional language.
It is. It's making that effort to show them you care.
And it doesn't have to be big gestures. Even sending a nice text message or making time for a video call can have a huge impact,
Right. It's those little things that remind them you're still connected, you're still a team.
even though you're miles apart.
Yes. You know, another thing that really stood out in the personal account was the importance of forgiveness.
Right.
These long separations, they can put a lot of stress on a marriage.
Yeah.
And people make mistakes.
It's about admitting when you've hurt someone, taking responsibility, and choosing to move on together.
Exactly. Forgiveness doesn't mean you're saying what happened was okay.
Right.
It's about letting go of the anger and resentment.
Because holding on to that just poisons the relationship.
It does. And it opens the door for healing.
It's about understanding that we're all human.
Yeah.
We all mess up.
Mm.
And sometimes the best way to show love is to forgive.
I agree.
But, it's not just about the couples themselves.
Right.
We as a society have to do our part to support these families.
We do.
We can fight for immigration policies that make it easier for families to be together. We can support organizations that help immigrant families.
Yeah.
And just be more welcoming and inclusive in our own communities.
Exactly.
It's about realizing that their stories are our stories.
They are.
Their struggles are our struggles.
All right.
We're all connected.
And we are.
Well, listeners, we've come to the end of our deep dive into this really important issue.
Yeah.
We've talked about the challenges, the heartbreak, but also the incredible strength these couples show.
They do.
And I hope that you're leaving here today not only feeling more informed, but also hopeful.
Yes.
Because even when things are tough, there's always hope, there's always love, resilience, and the chance to grow.
I agree.
Remember, every deep dive is just the beginning. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and share what you've learned with others.
I love that.
Until next time, keep diving deep.